but thank you for that. So the next speaker is Rebeca Capanema, and her discussion is going to be on peer scaffolding in EAP classrooms and their social material. Hold on, and their social material relations. So let me give the floor to you if you're sharing screen. Wonderful.
Okay.
And presenter mode.
1 second, yes. You see my notes? No?
Yeah, no, just your presentation.
Okay, awesome. Just 1 second. So, good morning, everyone. I think it's really cool that I'm presenting after such an interesting talk about ZPD and sociocultural theory. My name is Rebeca. I'm a master's student at Western University, and today I'll be presenting part of my literature review and theoretical framework of my proposed MA thesis study. I will also discuss a bit about methodological strategies that I intend to adopt. And the topic I have chosen to study, and Stephanie has already presented, is peer scaffolding in EAP classrooms and their social material relations. And I think that title gives away that I plan to not only address social relations that may arise from peer collaboration, but also look into the materiality of these relations and what that means for second language learners in EAP classrooms. So this is the agenda for today. I'll briefly mention the motivation for my study, which will be followed by an introduction of the topic. Then I will present what I have gathered so far in terms of literature review and how that created a gap that led me to adopt posthumanism as my theoretical framework. Then I'll briefly mention my methodological strategies and finally discuss future directions. So I really like this quote by Paulo Freire because I think that it concisely sums up how knowledge is co-constructed. And in my opinion, it has a lot to do with what I'll be discussing today in terms of how to address peer scaffolding from a post-humanist perspective, as relationality is a key tenet of new materialist approaches. So I think it's very much related to what I'll be talking about today. So knowledge emerges knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless and patient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, with the world, and with each other. So my interest in peer collaboration comes from my own experiences as a second language learner and as an English instructor in Brazil and in Canada. So from both perspectives, I could see some limitations of teacher-centered instruction, as well as the benefits of learner-learner interactions. And as a learner myself, most of the time I experienced the banking system of education that Paulo Freire talks about, especially in the regard that students are just receiving knowledge without reflecting on it, and this knowledge usually comes from the teacher. I have also experienced the benefits of learner-learner interactions. For example, when I worked with my peers during discussions in a professional master's program that I had the opportunity to take, especially in what concerns the co-construction of knowledge. So together, my peers and I, we would discuss and come up with some conclusions about readings, and it was really interesting to see how that relationships unfolded. So this, and then as an English instructor here in Canada, I took interest in studying how peer collaboration may or may not contribute to learners' language development. So I decided to study peer collaboration, and my initial idea was to use sociocultural theory as my theoretical framework. During my first term in this MA program, I was kindly presented to other perspectives that have broadened my view of language and language learning. I have been invited to decenter my anthropocentric mindset to consider other non-human and more than human actors that also engage with learners, their instructors, and the world around us. So I came to posthumanism, and its tenets have challenged me to think outside of the box in the sense that other knowledges and ways of being are possible, and that humans are not the center of the universe, which is something that seems so obvious, but it's still hard to grasp. And that's why I chose this quote from Pennycook, because it invites us to think the hard questions. Why do we think the way we think? Why do we create knowledge the way we do, and what and whose knowledges are valued and reproduced? So the question posthumanism presents us with is how and why we have come to think about humans in particular ways, with particular boundaries between humans and other animals, humans and artifacts, and humans and nature. However, I kind of was in a conundrum, because at the same time that I had noticed the gap in the literature concerning peer collaboration through a posthumanist lens, how could I research peer collaboration in the English for academic purposes classroom without making learners the center of my analysis? So most studies in peer scaffolding that I have reviewed so far focused mostly on the social relationships among peers, and they're usually analyzed from a sociocultural theory perspective, and usually take into account just one skill at a time. And in fact, scaffolding is a metaphor from sociocultural theory that dwells on the ideas of support and collaboration, like the previous presenters, my colleagues, also mentioned. And these ideas of co-construction and co-creation also resonate with posthumanism. So the question that remained is whether it was possible to decenter the human while studying collaboration among peers. And the answer to that is a concept that I will discuss next, which is relationality. And in this quote here, Kalin Tuhi talks about how things are becoming in relation to one another. Things, humans, animals are all entangled and becoming together. Therefore, there are no fixed, determinable, and essential qualities that can be attributed to the human and non-human. They are all becoming in relation to one another, she says. And that is also called, or referred to as relational ontology. So the relational aspect of posthumanism has led me to my study. I want to understand how learners and their peers are becoming together with me as a researcher, their instructors, and the material world around them. And from what I have gathered so far, most studies look at peer collaboration or peer scaffolding, as I said, through a sociocultural perspective, using researchers' point of view, and usually focus on a single skill. My proposed study will we use posthumanism as a theoretical framework, and I will try to gather as many accounts as I can from the perspective of the students, instructors, and mine. I want to understand and explore how peer collaboration takes place in EAP classrooms in Canada, and what are some of the human and non-human factors that may foster or hinder it, and what assemblages are formed and how they interact. So my final goal actually is to tell stories, and I'm gonna go back to this concept again. I'm not planning to give definitive answers or best practices. I will try to tell stories from and with the classrooms. So to be able to study peer collaboration from a posthumanist point of view, I have come up with these 3 research questions. And the last question is a bit tricky, as from a post-human perspective, there are no absolutes, no one-size-fits-all approach. My goal then with this question is to tell stories from what worked in these particular classrooms that I will have the opportunity to learn from, and not in general. This quote by Tui, inspired by the work of Deleuze, sums up what a post-humanist approach means. I think this will be very useful for me going ahead, and it says that we should adopt an and approach, not one thing or the other. And as I said before, many studies in the literature focus on peer collaboration or peer scaffolding from a social cultural perspective. But using the and approach mentioned by Tui, I cannot disregard what has been done before in terms of theories that have looked at this topic and the work that has been done. So with that in mind, how could I use what I have gathered so far to push forward, to advance and challenge my accustomed way of thinking about second language learning and peer collaboration? So I think the key to that is to look at it with a curious mind and an inquisitive spirit. And from what I have learned so far about peer collaboration, culture, beliefs, and attitudes play an important role when peers are working together. Also, teaching how to scaffold and how to collaborate seem to be a common thread in these studies. Another thing that I have noticed is that from a sociocultural perspective, it is easy to see the immaterial, ideational, cultural, symbolic aspects of language. But what posthumanism does is go a bit beyond the immateriality of languages to accept that languages can also be material and that they are in relation to other material things like humans, spaces, objects. So this leads to the quote by McClure, and I'm going to read that for you. But we also, I think, need to find ways of researching and thinking that are able to engage more fully with the materiality of language itself. The fact that language is in and of the body, always issuing from the body, being impeded by the body, affecting other bodies, yet also, of course, always leaving the body, becoming immaterial, ideational, representational, a striated collective, cultural, and symbolic resource. So for my theoretical framework and with the and approach, I use sociocultural theory as a starting point. So learning is socially constructed, but it is also materially constructed. Languages are psychological tools, but they are also materially immaterial and immaterial. Sorry about that. So they are psychological tools, but they are also material because they are being issued from the body and in relation to other material things. So with that in mind, I turn to posthumanism to help me understand how peers collaborate and how they are in relation to one another. Posthumanism, then, is an umbrella term responding to the need to rethink what it means to be human. But what does it mean to study language and language learning from a posthumanist perspective? The second quote sums up this meaning really well. A new materialist perspective on second language or additional language education research will require radical rethinking of language learning, not solely as an individual cognitive accomplishment and not only as a social practice, but also as ongoing phenomena entangled with material elements in the world, including human bodies, languages, and a myriad of other environmental things. I also think that it's really important to acknowledge that these ways of thinking proposed by posthumanism are not a recent Western invention, but they have been around for a long time in indigenous scholarship, for example. So what I find fascinating about posthumanism is that this centers the human to understand humans and non-humans in relation to one another, forming unique assemblages. So Pennycook in 2020 says that we need to understand that language learning happens in and around a much wider set of semiotic assemblages, including touch, smell, taste, things, and places. And this brings significant consequences. Sorry. Go back. Okay, go back. Here, found it. This brings significant consequences to how we would see peer collaboration and the assemblages formed in the classrooms, for example. So thinking relationally, I want to understand the entanglements and assemblages between humans and non-humans during interactions. Language is not only a mediation tool, but it's material and interacts with other human and non-human actors. There's also the physical classroom, the space and time in which the class takes place, the chairs, desks, technology, and how all that interacts with human material bodies. And there's also the idea of repertoires, and as Pennycook puts it, they are emergent and relational. And as I said before, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. From a posthumanist perspective, there are no formulas of what works and what doesn't work. There are stories and assemblages and interactions that are unique, and my goal is to tell some of those stories. So what do I plan to do in terms of methodology?
Sorry to interrupt, but
Okay.
yeah, we're out of time.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I'm going to skip the methodology part. I'm just going to read this quote about, I'm just going to skip that. So just for future directions, I plan to tell stories, and telling stories is an education of attention. Through it, things are pointed out to novices so that they can discover it for themselves, what meanings that the stories might hold in situations of their current practice. So in summing up really quickly, I'm not planning to give definitive answers. So my goal is to tell stories and create more discussions and possibly foster more sustainable and socially just pedagogies in that regard. So these are my references. Thank you for listening. And this is a very lovely quote by Kanagaraja, and I think it is really what I think in terms of using posthumanism